Welcome to a conversation between photographer David Levinthal and our senior curator of contemporary interpretation, Joanna Marsh. It's always a treat to hear from an artist, and I can tell you that David is a great storyteller, so we're in for a delightful evening. I also wanted to pause and not only recognize David, who's sitting up front, but his family, who's come from far away, from Utah and California, nephews, sisters, and the tall youngest brothers. Please join me in welcoming David and his family. After this program, I invite all of you to join us for the reception for the celebratory opening of American Myth and Memory, David Levinthal Photographs. For those of you who do not know me, I have the pleasure of serving as the Margaret and Terry Stent Director here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and also our branch museum, the Renwick Gallery. Very often I hear from people, once I introduce myself as the director, what's on view? Of course, I'm always happy to share that news of the exciting programs and exhibitions we have going on here. But it's truly the curious questioner who says, why? Why this exhibition? Why now? And so I'm going to let you in on a secret. Why do we have this special exhibition at this moment in time? It all began with a gift. Actually, two, maybe even three gifts, now that I count it. In 2017 and 2018, we received really remarkably generous gifts of large bodies of David Levinthal's work. One comes from Donald Rosenfeld, who is here with us tonight, so please join me in thanking Donald for his generosity. The other donor has chosen to remain anonymous, but could be sitting next to you. So these generous gifts, totaling some 500 works, really put us in a very special position at the Smithsonian American Art Museum as really one of the preeminent depositories of his work. The next gift I wanted to share with you is David's gift himself. Once he realized that we would have such a meaningful body of work here at the nation's capital, he thought about his own collection, in this case, not the toys, although I would love to have the toys, David, but rather his journals, his papers, his notes. And that gift goes to our sister institution, the Archives of American Art. Again, our sister institution. That's worth clapping for, too. As you may know, the Archives is the world's preeminent and most widely used research center with a focus on collecting, preserving, and providing access to primary sources that document the history of the visual arts in America. And those of you who really know this building well, you know that there's a separate gallery dedicated to sharing some of their treasures. So it's always wonderful when we can have both a deep holding of an artist's work and then important archival materials. So for anyone who in the future, for now and in the future, wants to understand and fully delve into the creative world that David Levinthal has created, you have to come here to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and also using the resources of the Archives of American Art. Please know we are honored to be entrusted with these treasures. And as the keepers of the largest and most inclusive collection of American art in the world, totaling some 44,000 works of art and counting, we have a sacred duty also to collect artists in depth, really seminal American artists, David Levinthal, photographers like Lee Friedlander, painters like Alma Thomas and William H. Johnson, as other examples. This gives us a unique insight into the work of artists who have played such an important role in the life of our cultural community, inspiring other artists. David, as you'll hear, was mentored by Walker Evans, and as a young man, as a very young man, and I know he's an inspiration to many others. Here at the museum, we explore ways that images both perpetuate and question stereotypes in American life. And this exhibition in particular invites you to look closely at what seem at first to be very familiar images, but then I hope you'll look longer and find the intriguing and maybe even the questionable parts of the exhibition and the individual works, which are grouped in various themes, and Joanna Marsh will talk about that a little bit more in a moment. One of my great duties and pleasures is to thank the supporters of this exhibition, and they are the Marjorie and Edgar Macinter Exhibitions Fund, the William and Christine Ragland Family Photography Endowment, and the Bernice Stadium Endowment Fund. As you've heard me say before, I'd be happy to say your name here from the podium. You simply need to be a supporter of one of our projects. Please join me in thanking Joanna Marsh and her colleague Melissa Hendrickson in so carefully selecting and crafting a powerful display, a very interesting insight into a 40-year career of a remarkable American artist. Thank you, Joanna. What may seem usual to you is really unusual in the sense that most photographers capture the outside world. They document what we see and what we experience. It is the unusual artist, a group of artists that David is leading among, who focus on an interior world that they've composed. Again, sort of magically created landscapes, environments, historical moments, influenced by pop culture, by mass media, and yes, by memories. And they all offer us an insight into the world that we live in and what we call the American identity, ever shifting, ever increasing as we tell ourselves and future generations those kind of founding stories, sometimes founding myths of what it means to be truly American. I also remind you that photography helps people see the world. And what I really appreciate about David Levinthal is he helps us see America in a different and very powerful way. Without further ado, I think you really want to hear from the artist, and certainly Joanna Marsh, our very talented curator. I'm going to invite Joanna Marsh now to the podium. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. I have just a few housekeeping items to run through before introducing tonight's program and bringing David to the stage. I know that's why everyone's really here tonight. First of all, there will be a 15-minute question and answer period following David's and my conversation. We've invited guests, all of you, to write questions on cards. At the conclusion of our conversation, you'll pass those cards towards the aisles, and my colleagues from the Public Programs Department will collect them and then hand them to me on the stage. We'll also, as Stephanie mentioned, have a reception in our Kogod courtyard following the program tonight, and we would invite all of you to be there with us. Next, I want to echo Stephanie's thanks to our donors and acknowledge a few other people who work closely with me on this project. From David Levinthal's studio, Aaron Hudak and Ryan Oskin, who attended to countless details and a steady stream of questions from me and my colleagues. Filmmaker Donald Rosenfeld and one of our donors, and film editor Hope Needles, who worked on the introductory video in our galleries, exhibit designer Sarah Gray, and graphic designer Nathaniel Phillips, as well as lighting designer Scott Rosenfeld, who made the gallery shine in every way. Paper conservator Kate Maynor, as well as our frame specialists Tom Irian and Martin Kotler, who prepared all of the works for view. My interpretation team, Stephanie already mentioned, Melissa Hendrickson, as well as Ann Showalter and Kelly Skeen, who were really thought partners on this project from its inception and who helped to craft the dynamic interpretive materials that are on view in the galleries. And then, of course, David Levinthal, who has been the most gracious artistic partner on this project that a curator could ever wish for. Thank you, David. So, with that, It seems fitting that we're gathered tonight on the heels of the 75th anniversary of D-Day to talk about an exhibition that focuses on how historic events and iconic cultural subjects are collectively remembered and mythologized. It is doubly fitting because David Levinthal's first major photographic series, there it is, focused on events of World War II, specifically Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. The project, titled Hitler Moves East, was a collaboration with friend and former classmate Gary Trudeau. Levinthal employed toy soldiers and meticulously constructed sets to stage the trek by Hitler's troops into the former Soviet Union between 1941 and 1943. The sepia-toned images that you see here, oh, but you don't see them. I might need some help. Really? Okay. I'm going to keep talking. So the sepia-toned images were published in the book that you see here in 1977 and really set the stage for Levinthal's now decades-long preoccupation with history, memory, and myth. The photographs provoke questions that still hover over David Levinthal's work. What am I looking at? What am I looking at, Billy?
That one? There we go.
Yeah, that one. Thanks. What am I looking at? Is this a document, a film still, or a fabrication? Are these actually human beings? Levinthal and Trudeau's reinterpretation of the war was based on hours spent studying archival battle photographs and news footage of Hitler's advance eastward. But it was equally inspired by their, quote, experience of the war, how the war was passed down to them through films, novels, plays, poems, and even toys. Levinthal's subsequent bodies of work were and are equally informed by various forms of visual culture, from film noir, which, see if I can do this right. There we go. Got it. To televised westerns, to photojournalism, and even 19th century painting. At the same time, his photographs explore and critique these various forms of visual culture. Media, pop culture influence the way we experience, understand, and collectively remember people, objects, and events. Levinthal's innovative practice of using toys to surface deeply rooted societal ideals and assumptions invites us to look more closely at what we think we know about these subjects and what they say about who we are. It's now my pleasure to invite David Levinthal to the stage.
Hi, and before we begin, I just want to thank you and everyone here at the museum who's worked so incredibly hard. Joanna and I first started working on this back in 2013, and it's been a long but wonderful process. I love your title about myth and memory. However, now that I've just turned 70, I thought perhaps we could add a question mark after memory. But I'm delighted to be here and so honored and thrilled about having this exhibition at the Smithsonian.
Thank you, David. So David jokes about his memory, but in fact, he's not just a terrific visual storyteller, but also a great storyteller verbally, and I hope you'll share some tonight. First of all, what I want to ask is, what's appealing about photographing toys? Why toys?
Well, I think I gave you a very glib answer earlier by saying, they always show up for work and they don't talk back. That was particularly true of the Barbie series. You never never had to worry about them gallivanting around at Studio 54 and coming in unable to stand up. I think part of it is just my own personal history. Playing with toys, playing with toy soldiers. There's a wonderful photograph that you've included in the exhibition, and I believe the process area of that my sister found when we were going through my grandmother's things many years ago. And it's of me lying on the floor playing with these beautiful German-made cowboy and Indian figures. And I think that was just sort of the beginning of a long association I had with toys. And I think one of the things you do when you're playing with toys is you imagine a world that they're in. And I think that has always stayed with me. I mean, I never intended to become an artist. I entered Stanford in 1966, wanting to become a constitutional lawyer. I'll tell a short story about how parents are trying to do the best for you, and things actually work out for the best, but totally not what they were planning. During pre-Reg week, while everybody else was running around, getting drunk and doing things, I was sitting down with the head of the poli-sci department, who was a friend of my parents, and he proceeded to tell me that I shouldn't take the introductory poli-sci class in the fall, or I should take his class in the spring because I was, so brilliant. And it ended up being a class that was mostly for sophomores and juniors, and was held in a big auditorium, actually even bigger than this. But what really convinced me that poli-sci was not for me was the, I believe, 8 or 9 books we were to read about local elections in small hamlets throughout New England. And those of you who may have gone to school around that time might remember the Bob's Merrill pamphlets that one had to read. I believe I read 2 pamphlets and 2 of the books. The class was the most pedantic exercise that I ever encountered in my 4 years at Stanford. I remember on the final exam, I poured all of my knowledge from those 2 books and the 2 pamphlets into it. And I got a B+, and the comment, "Wish you could have elaborated more on this." And I restrained myself from writing and saying, "Me too." But that was the end of my poli-sci career. And I eventually found my way, first to, making films, very, very briefly as a classics major, which was odd for somebody who didn't take Latin in high school, but that's a whole nother story. But I discovered photography at something called the Free University. And you have to remember this is, the mid-60s, the Bay Area. The Free University was basically totally unstructured environment where anyone could teach a course about anything. The Nobel-winning physicist William Shockley taught a course about the genetic inferiority of African Americans, and there was also a course which probably would have changed my life if I had any idea what it was. Tantric yoga and LSD. As a 17-year-old, a very sheltered 17-year-old, I would have run right to that class if I had any idea what was involved. But I ended up taking a photography class because the person teaching it, who's a graduate student in biology, was somebody that my sister knew, even though she's younger than I am. She had worked on a film he was doing one summer. And I thought Dwight was like the coolest guy in the world. Every time I saw Dwight, there were always like two beautiful women with him. This is despite the fact that he was actually married to the sister of one of my best friends from high school, but that's a whole, it was the 60s. And so I showed up at, I think the first and actually only class happened at somebody's home. And Dwight showed me how to develop film and make a print. And I continued sort of hanging out and working with him. The class never sort of met after that point. They were mostly all grad students in like sciences. And that's where I developed my passion for photography. And very fortuitously, there was no photography taught at Stanford. And I say fortuitously because it made me sort of seek out my own education. And one of the people, Ruth Bernhard, who is, one of the sort of great figures in photography, she was part of the F-64 group with Ansel Adams and, in that whole Edward Weston group. She ran out of her home in San Francisco on Green Street, the Ruth Bernhard School of Photography. And so I went up there, I took some classes, and, I think the fact that everything was done as an extracurricular activity meant I had to really want to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a great benefit to me. Now, of course, Stanford has, an MFA program, but I think it really, tested my interest and my desire.
I'm curious, since you're talking about teachers, and Stephanie in her opening remarks mentioned Walker Evans. Mm-hmm. So after graduating from Stanford, you went on to Yale University's School of Art, where you studied under Walker Evans, mm-hmm. and began to develop a style that couldn't have been farther from the documentary style of mm-hmm. Evans's work. And I'm curious sort of what that transition was like, and how he continued to mentor you despite you going in a very different direction.
Well, Walker was a very, very interesting man. And along with one of his proteges, William Christenberry, who's, very well known here in the DC area, both great storytellers. Walker loved talking about literature, particularly French literature. He really didn't have that much interest in talking about photography. He had gone to Paris as a young man, wanting to be a writer. And it was only subsequently that he, delved into photography. Mm-hmm. So I had a seminar with Walker and, knew him. I got to know him more because one of my classmates, Jerry Thompson, ended up both printing for Walker and sort of taking care of him in the last few years of his life. And Jerry was, just a magnificent and fastidious printer. And he told this great story. He was out at Walker's home in Old Lyme making some prints, and Walker came in, he saw this print in the garbage, and he starts to pull it out and get a pen and sign it. And he say, oh, this will be fine for that woman in Fairfield. Jerry took it out of his hands and said, Walker, I'm going to make a good print. And I think it was, I went to Yale specifically because of Walker Evans. Mm-hmm. I'd looked at his photographs, and just being able to study with somebody of that significance, I felt was something I really wanted to do. And it's funny because when I was applying for teaching jobs, this back in the day when letters of recommendation were, quote, confidential, I had sent off I'd met these people at the College Art Association from the University of Kansas, and I was applying for a job there. When I got my portfolio returned without an offer of a teaching job, inside they had mistakenly placed my 4 letters of recommendation. And, the 3 from, the other faculty members and the head of the department, they were nice, they were your typical. And Walker had written a short 2-paragraph letter in which he said, David is an extraordinarily talented and gifted photographer and would be a wonderful addition to your faculty. Apparently they didn't think so, but Stephanie mentioned the Archives of American Art. That letter is now there, and I was so touched by it because Walker would never say anything like that to me personally, but it was wonderful to know that he saw in this very raw work. I mean, I literally started with the toy soldiers photographing on my bedroom floor back in California over winter break. And I remember in January, when we came back to school, we had portfolio review. And there were 4 photographers in my year, and then there were 3, or 4, I guess, in the year following. And everybody came in with, particularly like Jerry, these just beautiful prints, printed using the same technologies Edward Weston had used, and they were all shooting with 8x10 deer dwarfs or 4x5 deer dwarfs, and they'd bring in this portfolio of elegant prints. We went in sort of one at a time, and I came in with probably about 250 Codalith prints in boxes, and I put stacks by everybody, and I said, I just started working on this, I'm really excited about it, and there was dead silence. Fortunately, Linda Connor from the Art Institute in San Francisco was there as a visiting artist, and Linda spoke up and said, oh, these are amazing, this is, and I always use this story when I'm talking to students because it's like when you study physics in high school and they put a hockey puck on dry ice and they just give it a little push and it just keeps going and going and going. Linda was that little push, and we've managed to stay friends over the years. We even appeared at the San Jose Museum in a setting just like this talking, and I've always made it a point to tell her just how much I appreciated that, because that was the energy that I needed to just keep me going for the rest of the year. And to their credit, it wasn't like the other faculty members were negative. They were just sort of, I remember John Sarkowski came for a visit to Yale, and he looked at him, and people were just like, I have no idea what this is. But they weren't discouraging me. They were just sort of, but having that little, encouragement was really all that I needed. And then after graduation, Gary's publisher, Andrews McNeil, we had exchanged some work, and Gary's thesis was a faux biography of a German Luftwaffe pilot done only in images and graphic symbols. I've known Gary for almost 50 years. I'm not sure I really fully understand what he was doing, but when John McNeil and Jim Andrews saw some of my Codalith prints, they foolishly suggested that Gary and I do a book together. Now, we had no idea what we were going to do. We got a huge advance. We each got $750. And I remember Gary saying to me when he handed me my check, if you cash this check, we really have to make this book happen. We signed contracts. We were supposed to do it in a year. It took 3.5 years. There were little, diversions, such as Gary being awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Doonesbury, Watergate, and things like that. And that, again, was also fortuitous, because my work really went through significant changes. I would say that I did like 3 iterations of photographs. And the photographs in the book all came from a period of about 6 to 8 months when I was living in New Haven and teaching, and had set up my apartment into this sort of giant studio. Gary came over one day to help me, and New Haven being such a big emphasis on theater, you could go and find like Exploding Powder, a theater store. And I'd set up that little image of the figures on the hill. Mm-hmm. Gary took the liberty of taking one figure, sticking a pin in it, sticking him in the hill. The pin totally blended into the grass. So when I shot it, it looked like he was suspended in the air. Mm. I remember putting, a little bit of this powder, and I think we lit it with a cotton ball, and it kind of went poof. And Gary said, "Here, give me this." And he started spreading it the way a 10-year-old would spread salt on French fries at a bowling alley. So we lit it, and there was a sound. It sounded like a shotgun going off. The cotton ball bounced against the window, but the negative, which was virtually opaque, made this great picture. I will say that when I moved out, the landlord couldn't return my deposit fast enough. Despite the fact that there was stuff all over his carpets, he was just like, "Get out of here. If you ever want an apartment, don't come back." So it was a wonderful experience, and I owe a great deal to Jim Andrews and John McNeil. And a few years ago, I did a small show at a gallery in New York of the Hitler Museum's work, and John McNeil came for a visit, and we walked through it, and he looked at the photographs, and he said, "I'm so proud of that book." It was the only art book they had ever done, and they have since not ventured into that area again. But it really helped, certainly my career to have, a book like that, and have it, when I moved to New York, I remember meeting Cindy Sherman and for the first time, and she said, "Oh yeah, we were up in Buffalo and passing that book around, and Richard Prince wrote an introduction to a later catalog that I did for this show in New York." And back in those days, there was no internet. You sort of knew what was going on in your immediate locale. And to hear that, Richard and Cindy, really, that work was significant to them, was a great feeling. And to know that it had, really gotten out there, and, that, in later years it became sort of a reference point.
Certainly.
There was even an article in some art magazine as more and more people started using toys in their work. And the writer suggested that, I forget whose show they were reviewing, that they had gone to the David Levinthal School of Photography. And I thought about getting diplomas made up and that I could hand out at openings.
You'll need a lot of them.
But it is, it's a wonderful feeling to know that, in your lifetime, that the work has had so much impact. And I think, for me, there's, I won't say it's a culmination because I'm planning to live a few more years. But to have this exhibition here at the Smithsonian is, it's one of those things. When I was younger, not in my wildest dreams. I think it would have been more realistic to dream that, Andy Warhol invited me to the factory or something and introduced me to Nico or something like that. But having a show at the Smithsonian was, beyond my wildest imagination.
You've talked a lot about the process of creating the Hitler Moves East series, which you shot on the Kodalith film, but you really became known for working with Polaroid technology, and used Polaroid film for well over 30 years of your career. So I'm curious, and much of the work in the present exhibition is shot with Polaroid, with the exception of some of the most recent bodies of work, which are digital. So that includes the SX70 Polaroids, the small instant Polaroids, as well as the large format 20 by 24s. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the influence of Polaroid on the development of your work. You know, having started with Hitler Moves East, shooting on the Kodalith, but then using and moving to an instant technology, and how that changed what you were doing.
Well, you know, there was a period in, I guess, the early 80s when I started printing on black and white paper, but hand coloring some of the modern romance work. And that was sort of my first introduction to color. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, if you were a serious artist, you used black and white. I mean, that was just sort of the way it was. And so the hand coloring, you know, I was sort of edging into color. I think I even went so far as to develop a couple of 8 by 10 color transparencies in the darkroom in my parents' house. And, you know, such a laborious process. You had all these baths, they all had to be at the same temperature. And I remember, to my great excitement, you know, it was an image of a motel in Santa Cruz, but I, you know, made it in color as opposed to, you know, the Kodalith prints. I was so excited, it was probably around like midnight, that my youngest brother Dan and I were sort of house sitting while my parents were living in DC. And I went into Dan's room and said, "Dan, I made this print." He was like, "Great." Show it to me in the morning. He didn't quite share my enthusiasm at the moment. But the Polaroid, my first exhibition in New York was at the Marlborough Gallery. I think the title of the show was From Plato's Cave, and it featured Laurie Simmons, Ellen Brooks, James K. Spear, among others. And Ellen had some 4x5 Polaroids of the same HO scale, you know, these tiny figures that I had been using. And that got me to thinking about using color, and I you know, met with Ellen afterwards, and I said, you know, I'm thinking about doing some of this stuff in color. Would that be okay? Because I knew that, you know, this. And she said, "Oh, these were just test prints for me. I wasn't going to pursue it." And I tried doing some 4x5 Polaroids, but I ended up using the SX70 and setting it up and attaching it. Eventually, you know, I started photographing with the SX70. The film comes out the front, and Polaroid made for, I think, $3.50 a little clip-on macro lens, so I could get very close to these figures. The only problem was I had to be sure, as soon as I heard the motor start, I had to tilt the tripod back, or the film would knock over my little scene. And, you know, I got very adept at that, but I figured there had to be a better way. And I think this was in like 84, 85, something. They were just starting to make video cameras with significant magnification. And I went to, you know, one of the many photo stores in New York with a tiny little setup and my little figures, and sort of tested this out. This very nice young salesperson kept helping me, and I said to him, you know, we spent like 45 minutes, and I said, you know, I'm really sorry I'm taking up so much of your time. He said, please. Most people come in, they drop their kid on the floor, and it's, you know, videotaping him or her crawling around. He said, this at least is interesting. So I got a video camera, and what I did was I hooked it up to my television so that the image, I never actually recorded, but I could see the image on my television screen. And because the exposure time in the SX70 was fairly significant, you didn't get those diagonal lines that you sometimes get when you're photographing a TV screen. But you did get that sort of miniature pixelization, which added like another layer of realism to the photographs. And they looked like, surveillance videos. This was prior to the omnipresence of surveillance videos. So it worked great. And I regret that I didn't record because, I could go back and look at those scenes again. But, and it was a wonderful medium because it didn't involve having to process. And Polaroid in the 80s was so incredibly generous to artists. A friend of mine, Barbara Caston, was using a lot of Polaroid material, and she introduced me to someone there. And literally, I would call up Connie Sullivan and say, can I get some SX70 film? The next day, there would be, one or two cases would arrive. And eventually, Connie saw some of my SX70 work with Cowboys and proposed doing a show at the Kennedy Gallery in Cambridge that Polaroid sponsored. And I'd started to use the 2024 camera, and in those days an exposure was $25.
Could you describe, for those who don't know, what the 2024 camera is or was?
It's about the size of a refrigerator. Has a and because I was working with small figures, John Reuter, who ran the camera, we had it extended, 6 to 8 feet, the bellows. There was a vice grip holding something together on the side. But it was an amazing process because in about a minute or 90 seconds, you would peel this apart and you'd have your final image. And as I said, it was like $25 an exposure. And Polaroid would subsidize you. They'd give you a free day at the studio and 30 exposures. And then beyond that, it was, $25, which was less than it would cost to make, a Cibachrome print. So I became very enamored of that. And Connie offered me this show. And this is something I've never had a curator ever do to me. She called me up, I don't know, a month or so later and said she wanted to move up the date of the show. And I said, well, I was planning on shooting more at the Polaroid studio. And Connie's very direct. She said, well, how many days do you want? And I just picked a number out of thin air saying, 10. She said, okay, you got 10 days, 10 free days. And when I had my retrospective, in the late 90s at the International Center of Photography, one of the vice presidents of Polaroid was there, and I said, you're kind of like a drug dealer. You give me these free days, and then for the rest of my life, I'm sending you checks every month for all the film that I've continued to shoot. He took it in good stride. But it was a really, amazing process. And, sadly, over time, Polaroid had its own issues, but it was a difficult material, but an incredibly beautiful material because it was so saturated and so instantaneous. And, people often ask me about, say, the difference between shooting digitally and shooting with Polaroid. The commonality is, like in digital, you're seeing the image right away, so to speak. And the difference, of course, is, I can shoot hundreds of digital shots and not pay anything for it. But it's that same thing of, moving a figure slightly, which is why I ended up with thousands and thousands of Polaroids, which, now are in collections of museums like yours.
Exactly.
But there is a certain commonality there. one of the great advantages of digital is the sense of scale.
This is, maybe this one is
my friend Bill
example.
Wegman and I, Bill's used the camera for many, many years.
Yeah.
And I remember we were talking once at lunch, and he said, yeah, after a while you just start seeing everything vertically, because that's the format of the Polaroid. And both he and I think more so than I, have occasionally done diptychs and triptychs, but with digital, the scale is completely open. And one of the things that's wonderful about this exhibition is seeing some of the smaller digital prints and then some of the larger ones. I use 1/100th of 1% of the capabilities of my Hasselblad camera. I use one lens, even though I have like 6. I use the 120 macro lens. But it does what I want it to do, and it allows me to work within the scenes that I create and make those little adjustments and changes. And so I found it, a wonderful process.
Thank you. So we're going to sort of open things up to questions. So if you can send your cards to the aisles. And while we're collecting those questions, I'm going to ask you another one.
Okay.
Which sort of relates to the photograph that's on the screen behind us. Although I'm going to go and change to a scrolling slideshow in a moment. But you say it in the intro video that's in the gallery, and I've heard you say it on a number of occasions, that there's less in your photographs than meets the eye. And I wonder if you would expand on that.
Well,
I'm going to get up while you answer,
okay,
but I'm coming back.
I won't notice. What I mean by that, Joanna, is that when you look at an image, the viewer has so much visual memory of their own, particularly something like the JFK picture. It's, the object I photographed was like this big. So the figures were very small and kind of crudely painted and constructed. But you immediately know where it is by the flag on the corner of the car and Jackie's pink hat. And in fact, I had tried initially to put some buildings behind the scene, and that just didn't look good at all. And I was shooting in what was now my home, at the time was sort of my working loft and home. And I'd done a Custer's Last Stand photograph, so I had this sort of grassy hill. So I grabbed that and stuck it behind the car. And the moment I clicked the shutter, I knew that I had made a really special photograph. It was just instantaneous. But it was also, fortuitous. It's the last photograph that I took in the studio before we did our renovation so that our son could have his own room and not be living next to the washer-dryer. Something that he pointed out to us on many occasions, that he was the largest thing in his room besides the washer and dryer. I think that's true of really all my work, that it recalls the modern romance. I used to go, when there were revival theaters in New York back in the 80s, to every film noir that I could go see, and I had my little notepad and I'd make little sketches. But those photographs, reminded me so much of film stills. And I remember a curator in London, when I did a show there many years ago, said, my modern romance photographs look like stories. Something had happened before and something was going to happen. And the photograph was that moment in between. And as I often do, I find curators, such as yourself in particular, so much more eloquent about my work than I could ever be. So I sort of co-opt your phrases over time and kind of make them my own, mainly by forgetting exactly what you had said. But yeah, I can't remember the first time that I used that, but it seemed to me, because if you looked at what's actually in the photograph, there's not that much, but there's so much memory that's evoked by looking at it. And with the cowboy, the Western work, it's so much about the Western films. I remember doing a symposium in Austria that David McCullough, the great historian, was part of, and they were showing some of my Western work. And at one point, I said, my photographs are about a West that never was, but always will be. And he gave me the greatest compliment. This sort of wry smile came across his face, and I thought, wow, that's great. But it is true. I had a friend who was a Jungian analyst who used to ask me where I got all my toys from, because she would have like this little sandbox for her patients to set up things. But toys are so much a product of the time and the culture that they come from. And when my sister and I were growing up, she would get the dollhouse, I would get the gas station. And I love that the fact, in later years I acquired many Marx dollhouses. It was always the mother, the father, the older sister, younger brother, and then the baby of indeterminate sex. The mother was often in high heels with an apron, and she could hold the vacuum cleaner. I mean, it was so, Father Knows Best and Ozzie and Harriet combined. And as a way of sort of socializing, I know that in the movie Born on the 4th of July, there's an opening sequence where the Tom Cruise character, is playing in the backyard with his friends, war, and then it sort of transforms into a scene of them getting off the landing craft on the beach in Vietnam. And I always thought, it's, you make war, you project it as something that it's not. And Oliver Stone's film is, about that a lot, in the way that, the character, the real life character, was lost, I think, both his legs, and became this outspoken critic of the war and for veterans' rights. But it starts off with this sort of playful, the way when I was growing up, we played cowboys and Indians, and everybody had their holster set of their favorite television cowboy. My first one was Hopalong Cassidy. It's about not just the memory from films and TV, but it's no longer as popular now, but Life magazine. I had a friend who had the entire collection of Life magazine from the first issue, and I loved going over to his house and looking at like the magazines from World War II, which became the way people sort of learned about the war. And I remember in later years the issue that came out that was so powerful. It was a little like high school yearbook photo of everyone killed that week in Vietnam, and some were in their prom outfits and some were in military outfits, and it just had their name and where they were from, and there was no commentary, and it went on for page after page after page, and it was the most heartbreaking and profound statement about the cost of that war.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, it's interesting, is in one of the photographs that's upstairs in the history section, your No Man's Land photograph of World War I, that's something I thought a lot about also, the idea of the myth of the glory of battle being lost, and that war and the tremendous casualties and fatalities sort of destroyed that myth. Speaking of Life magazine and current events, one of the questions that I have here on the card is whether there are current events or people of the last decade that you feel warrant recreation or production as one of your photographs.
Probably. You know, I'm one of those people who I'll see something interesting and I'll acquire it long before I ever know exactly what I'm going to do with it. I don't want to cause any political riff in the audience, but I did come across a Barbie-sized Donald Trump with a background of the Oval Office. And it was one of those things like, you know, I got to have it, have no idea what I'm actually going to do with it. I do also have a Barbie-sized Vladimir Putin. So, you know, maybe someday.
Someday. Too soon. Too soon, I think.
When I feel like, there won't be, I won't be attacked on Fox and Friends, or, people won't be looking up my address in New York and harassing my family.
So there's may I? I'm just going to let that lie. So one of the other questions here is an interesting one. So what other style would you like to explore, or is there a style that you've been hesitant or afraid to pursue?
Not really. I mean, I feel, it may be subtle, but I feel my style has changed over the years. That part of it is, I've been doing this for so long that, I can set things up and often be very close to where I want to end up. Just, sometimes not. I mean, sometimes, again, it's just happenstance. I was telling you about the wagon train photograph with the sunset. I'd set up, you can see the diorama that's in the exhibition. I think it's 6 feet by 3.5 or 4 feet. It's huge. And I set up with, this background, and I photographed, and there was like this little crescent shape of light coming through. And my first reaction was, I got to lower the background a little bit. But fortunately, I did a double take, and I thought, oh my God, it looks like, a sunset or a sunrise. And, I kept shooting and even, played around a little bit with that, bring it up a little bit and stuff. And so I think, within my, quote, style, there's always changes. I think I'm, maybe more prone. It took me a while, particularly with working with Polaroid, I could never pull back very far. So with the digital, it gave me a chance to do more expansive scenes. But at the same time, I'll on occasion get very close. Part of that is because I've been spending my son's education fund to buy really beautiful models and dioramas. I don't think he'll miss college that much. So I'm able to utilize, again, like that diorama where all those figures were uniquely sculpted for that piece and done, so beautifully that there's no bad angle. And that, just gives me tremendous flexibility. But I think I have sort of a roughly defined style. On occasion, people will, I remember years ago, I think it was Microsoft did a series of ads with 1/27 scale Prizer figures. And I had friends say, "Oh, wow, that was so cool. You did, these Microsoft ads." I said, "Wasn't me. I, could have called, been happy to do it." But I don't really foresee any radical change. I mean, for me, a radical change is, say, shooting down on a diorama. The project that I've been...
Have you done that?
A little bit, but for my next big series, which is going to be on Vietnam, and I've been collecting material for quite a few years, I mean, probably almost 10 years. I came across this little, very simple, inexpensive diorama that has sort of a ground scene, and it has two jets sort of elevated. And by photographing straight down, I'm thinking that, you won't see the bases for the planes. I mean, and they're cheap little plastic planes, but they're, some detail. But you will get the sense of them flying over this grassland. And, it's sort of in my repertoire, so to speak, but for me, I don't foresee any really dramatic change.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing and maybe adding to our collection that aerial view of one of the Vietnam dioramas. That concludes our program. Thank you so much, David, for being here.
Thank you.